Isn't it horrible when stuff just like flat out pops out of the tree? I mean, you ever cut a tree down, maybe you've had that happen. Well, good to see you today. We're continuing our series, Restoring the Merry in Christmas. And over the last few weeks, we've been looking at how we chart a course to a happy life. And we've been looking at how material things, possessions, the stuff we have, that it falls short of that expectation, that it's not going to meet our needs, that ultimately possessions are not the key path to happiness. And in fact, happiness is not something you can purchase. You can't pick it up on Amazon, do next day delivery, have it delivered, and have it on your front porch. It's not something that's immediately accessible. But in fact, it's a process of sowing and reaping over time, healthy, God-honoring responses in the lives and situations that we face, whether it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we all face that in our circumstances. Sometimes we got good, bad, ugly circumstances. Sometimes our relationships can be good, bad, or ugly as well. And so sowing those positive, God-honoring responses over time brings God's favor and actually brings us to the point where we do have this abiding sense of joy, where we experience happiness. But there's another huge problem that you and I face on this course, charting this course to happiness, and it's this, that we sow and reap our way to happiness, but the truth is every one of us has done exactly the opposite. We also sow and reap our way to unhappiness. I've done it, you've done it. It's when you make a bad decision and that bad decision brings some bad consequences. It's when we respond to pressure or people or difficulties, problems in our lives in ways that are detrimental, that we actually have a bad situation that we've kind of made worse. We've got the kindling and we throw fuel on it, and we've got this inferno of our own creation. Every one of us has done that. We've all sowed the wrong seeds. We've all reaped the consequences. But there's an undergirding philosophy that fuels our missteps. A philosophy that's so powerful and so prevalent, that's so evident in the world around us, that sometimes we're almost oblivious to it. We're almost like, I don't even hear it because it's so dramatically present in our world and in our mind. It's a megaphone in our ears. It's this idea, this mental equation that says that pleasure is going to be the best path to the best life. That if I seek pleasure, I will find that, if it's my A1 priority, leading me to the life that I long for and desire the most. It's a popular philosophy today that says that pleasure should be our number one goal. That's what we want. But as you look through history, things repeat themselves, and we go back 2,000 years ago to the life of Paul, to the first century, and to the early church. And we see that is exactly the same philosophy that's so powerful and prevalent in our lives right now. It was also very prevalent in the life of the early Christians. And I want to look today at a passage in the book of Ephesians where Paul gives some details about what's going on here. Now, as some background to the book of Ephesians, Ephesians is a letter that's written by Paul to the Christians who were at Ephesus, a city. And Paul writes this letter, and he says to them, you are doing so many things right. You're doing so many things right. He says, basically, you are faithful in Christ Jesus. So in other words, they had crossed the line of faith. They had admitted that they've fallen short of what God wants them to be. They had entered into a relationship with Christ. They weren't embracing religion. Jesus never came to make us more religious. He came to introduce us into a life-transforming relationship. And they had entered into this relationship. They were experiencing newness and power and life change that was beneficial to them and their families and their community. Good things were happening. But at the same time, this same church and these Christians were under pressure, big-time pressure. Pressure to cast away their passion for Christ. Pressure to walk away from their faith. And pressure specifically to buy into the philosophy of life that they had once embraced but had left behind. A philosophy just like we're talking about that says, actually, the most important thing is to pursue your pleasures, to make that your driving force, your A1 priority. And Paul addresses this pressure that they faced in great detail, beginning in Ephesians 4, verse 17. He says this, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They're darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their heart. Having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more." So Paul here is addressing a temptation that these Christians were facing, and it was to go back to the old life. Let's go back to the life I had before I accepted Christ into my own heart, to go back to the old ways, what the old friends were doing, to go back to the old philosophy of life that everyone else says is the absolute way to go back to the old way and pursue pleasures, to make that the most important thing, to sow and reap according to what you feel and what you want and what you decide for yourself. And Paul begins to dissect this concept, this idea, this philosophy of pursuing pleasures. He says that the Ephesians were to no longer live, in verse 17 it says, as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. So first of all, he's addressing Gentiles. And now for us, as we read that, we're thinking Gentiles are non-Jews. That's what we're talking about here. And that's true, but it's way broader than that, way bigger than that. When Paul references Gentiles, when the New Testament makes reference to that, it's really speaking about a heart condition, a spiritual position and condition of the heart. And here Paul describes it in certain words. He says that we were darkened, we were in futility, we were separated from the life of God, and basically we had made a decision that I no longer need to live according to God's plan and purpose, that I can kind of do my own thing, chart my own course, set my own direction. I can go back to the philosophy that excluded Jesus and build a new worldview that excludes him from my value system and excludes him from the world I build and put myself at the center of. Basically, it comes down to this whole idea that I can declare my independence from God. And as we do that, Paul says that something begins to happen to our spiritual arteries deep within our chest, that we become hardened. Our heart becomes hardened to the things of God, that I've excluded Christ, and you know what? I'm just going to do it without him. I don't need God anymore. I don't want to hear about him. Definitely not interested in church stuff. I'm not going to talk about spiritual things. Let's just throw it all aside because I don't want it anymore. And in fact, over time, there's a callousness. There's a hardness. There's a petrifying of their heart that takes them further and further from God. But Paul says something interesting here. He says that when you take God out of the equation, when you build a life and a worldview that excludes him, and you got a value system based on your choices, what you feel and what you want to happen in the moment, when you do that and take God out of the picture, something or someone has to replace him. Like something has to replace him. Someone has to be at the top of the totem pole. Something has to be all important. Somebody has to sit on the throne of our hearts, and if it's not him, then it has to be something else. And Paul tells us exactly what they had tended to replace him with, the greatest temptation you and I face as well. Verse 17, he says, having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to a new substitute God, to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. They've taken a higher power out of the equation, and in a very real sense, they've replaced him with themselves. Now, sensuality, our senses guide our direction and our path and our values. Our senses, in other words, there's no law but self. I call the shots. I establish the law. And honestly, if I want to break the law, I'll set it up. But if I want to break it, I could do that too because I'm in charge. There's no God to impede me anymore. There's no God to shackle me, to ruin my life, to drain my life of fun, because I've replaced him with myself. I'll find my own happiness. I'll chart my own course. And we come to this point where we do what we want to do, and we embrace a philosophy that you've heard, a philosophy that probably some friends told you when they gave you advice, a philosophy that is very prevalent in our culture that we cannot escape, and it's this: do what feels good. Whatever feels good to you, do it. Follow your heart. If your heart says go this direction, just follow your heart. Do whatever you want to do to be happy, and you'll find it. It's a philosophy that makes pleasure-seeking our A1 priority. He goes on to say that we're to indulge in every kind of impurity. The language here now gets into the sexual realm where we have sensuality and indulgence and impurity and those kinds of things. But the language transcends that to speak of any time that we basically say, God, I don't need your boundaries. I don't need your borders. I can do whatever I feel like. I will pursue it because it will satisfy me. I believe it's going to lead to the better life. So I'm just going to go for it, follow my senses to wherever they lead. Paul then describes where the end is in all of this. That, in fact, as they follow this pathway to sensuality, as they replace God with their own desires and feelings and drives, they have this continual lust for more. That's what Paul says here. That this comes with a continual lust for more. In other words, when you have a certain pleasure, you experience a certain pleasure, something's going to happen to you very quickly. You're going to want more of that pleasure. You get a certain pleasure, you're going to crave more of that pleasure. So in other words, the Greek language speaks of this greediness for satisfaction, that we're going to be ever looking for another pleasure. We're going to be looking for a higher high. We're going to look for a greater and greater thrill over time. And we'll have this continual lust, continual dissatisfaction, because we're going to be looking for whatever that more might be. The Ephesian believers face this pressure, and so do we all the time, to make our own senses, our desires, our heart, whatever we feel like doing, make that our guiding principle for the life we live. And in fact, we're told it will lead to a better life. But there's one huge problem with that philosophy. It never delivers. In fact, Paul is writing this letter so that we would avoid the biggest mistake that you and I can make. A mistake where we begin to think that pleasure actually is the key to the best life. That pleasure is the key to the joy that we hope to have. And I think this raises the question that maybe we have either consciously or unconsciously asked ourselves. And it's this: what is the relationship between pleasure and happiness? Like, what's the relationship between the two? Pleasure and happiness. There's a lot of confusion about the relationship. There's a lot of people with a lot of different views. But unless we get this straight, we're going to find ourselves wrecking our own lives. Because Scripture, and as we will see in a minute, science as well, tells us that pleasure does not lead to happiness. Pleasure, contrary to everything you're hearing, to the culture around us, contrary to how your heart is inclined at times, pleasure does not lead to happiness. It actually leads to hunger. It leads to hunger. It leads to a desire for more. It desires a higher plane of excitement. And so you kind of sometimes look at celebrities and you're like, okay, the guy or the girl's like, they got this beautiful wife, or like they got this beautiful spouse, this beautiful husband, and like they go off with someone else. You're like, what the heck? Are you losing your mind? Look at this girl. Look at this guy. They're beautiful. You got everything. They got this yacht. They got stuff. They take trips. They're all over the world. They eat the best food, and they're messing their lives up, screwing things up so bad. And you say, why are you taking drugs? Why are you sticking something in your arm? Why are you popping a pill? And it comes down to this: I need a higher high. It's not enough to have what I have now. I need something else because the thrill isn't there anymore. Pleasure is not a pathway to happiness. It actually leads to hunger. Pleasure is an appetite. It's a craving that will consume us. It desires more. It seeks more all the time. A greater thrill along the way. And pleasure, if we really look into it, has the power to seriously damage your life. If you want to damage your life, follow the path of pleasure. I mean, think about this, how pleasure can damage our lives. It happens when you eat that half gallon of ice cream watching the Christmas movies. Okay, so you're like, man, it's Christmas. So you go to the fridge, you pull out that half gallon of ice cream and kind of scoop it, and you're like, man, this is delicious. This is fantastic. So you're eating away, eating the ice cream and all that, and it's like, man, it was great. It's pleasurable. That's why we do it. But then eventually the movie ends and the container's empty and it sits on your counter and you're like, I don't want to look at the calorie count on that baby. I'll just throw that thing right out. And we're like, I feel lethargic. I just kind of feel slow. And it's like, how many calories did you eat? And it's like, okay, you keep doing it, following your pleasure. Keep scooping the ice cream. What happens over time is like, I'm gaining some weight here. I don't feel so good about myself. My energy level's dropping. I got to go buy new clothes. Are you serious? I don't want to do that. And so pleasure seems so great on the front end. We embrace it, but all of that, that's not happiness. Or we say, you know what? I was at work and there's this girl and there's this guy seriously paying attention to me. And my husband, my wife, they're at home. They're not paying attention to me. They take me for granted. They're not really reaching out to me. They're not paying attention like they once did. But this girl, she does. This guy, they pay attention to me. And so, I'll flirt with them a little bit, but at one point I kind of like it. It kind of gives me some pleasure and satisfaction. I feel attractive again, and then we cross the line and we get involved with them sexually. We have an affair, and we find ourselves in a situation where pleasure led us there, and it set our world on fire. And now we're trying to hide stuff. I got my phone, but don't look at my phone because I don't want you to look at my phone because I got some secrets in there. And so we hide that. And now all of a sudden, the marriage we could have invested in, the marriage that we could have made better by using this process of sowing and reaping, doing the hard stuff for good benefits, for long-term satisfaction. We could have invested in that marriage, but we didn't, and we now put it in jeopardy. Our kids just want a world that's stable, and we've destabilized it by our actions. And they're like, man, our world is turned upside down. And our reputation is sullied. It's broken down. And they're like, for what? For a pleasure. A pleasure, but not anymore. That's not happiness. The list goes on and on. We could say, I get bored. I get bored and I'm sometimes depressed, so I drink, okay? And I used to drink just on the weekends, just a little bit on the weekends, but now it's every night. And it's not just one drink or two drinks, it's more because I've gotten tolerant to it, so I need to drink a little bit more to feel the same buzz. And now all of a sudden, my kids are seeing and I'm hiding stuff in the garage so I can drink it when they're not looking. And I feel like, man, my marriage, I don't have energy for it, and I'm not there emotionally like I once was. And we begin to see the results. A lost license, a lost job, a lost relationship. All started with pleasure, but that's not happiness anymore. Whether it's a heroin high or a cocaine rush or a winning streak at the casino or, just this, I'm on Tinder and I'm kind of hooking up with different people. You can see the devastation that pleasure brings into our lives by its results. We see broken homes and broken marriages and broken lives. We see abortions and we see bankruptcies. We see all kinds of things happening that destroy us. Venereal disease. And we're like, I thought it was going to make me happy. And it didn't. It actually began to ruin me. It comes down to this whole idea that pleasure does not lead to happiness. Because it's an appetite. When you feed it, it will simply want more and more until it consumes you. You'll want more drugs. You'll get addicted. You'll want more sex. You'll want more porn. You'll want more gambling. You will want more things. And in the end, you will have less and less. This is what Paul's talking about when he writes 2,000 years ago about this very dynamic. He says that when we follow the way of the Gentiles, excluding God, when we take center stage and make this all about my feelings and doing what I want, something happens. He says, having lost all sensitivity, we're desensitized over time to what pleasure delivers to us. They've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity. And now here it is, with a continual lust for more. You're going to want more. And it's not going to deliver. It's going to ruin your life. Drop your guard. Take that drug. You set yourself up, not for happiness, but actually for hunger. See, ultimately, when we look at these kind of things, we have to address the biggest hindrance in our culture to happiness. The biggest hindrance to your happiness and mine is this idea that pleasure leads to happiness. It does not. It leads to hunger. And what's fascinating is it's not just the Bible saying this. Science says this too. And when I was in college, I went to Messiah College, they had a phrase they used all the time, that all truth is God's truth. It's 100% true. That in fact, all the different disciplines, they kind of coalesce, and Scripture and science align on this issue as well. Dr. Robert Lustig is an author, a researcher. He has a book called The Hacking of the American Mind, and he taps into neuroscience and medicine and psychology, and he draws fascinating conclusions about this very issue, the relationship between happiness and pleasure. And his conclusion is amazing. He's analyzed U.S. culture, and he found in his studies that we tend to confuse the two. We confuse happiness and pleasure. And he says in his work that they're not synonymous. They're not the same thing at all. They're way, way different. In fact, there's a different chemical reaction in your brain when you experience pleasure than there is a chemical reaction in your brain when you experience happiness. They're totally different. And in fact, what really is interesting is that the chemical that creates pleasure actually neutralizes the happiness chemical in our own brains, that in fact it undermines our happiness. He tells us that there are several key differences between pleasure and happiness. And I've just included a couple, and you might be looking at your notes saying, man, they're long this week. Wow, there's 2 pages of notes. Well, I wanted to include a bunch of this here because it's fascinating stuff. And I condensed it and eliminated a bunch of other points he made. But pleasure, first of all, in his research, pleasure, he found, is short-lived. It's quick. Boom, it's there. It kind of hits the reward center of the brain, and boom, it's done. And the next thing you know, it's like, wow, it's gone. It evaporated. It was great. It was a thrill for just a minute. Pleasure is short-lived. Happiness, however, is a deep-seated contentment and satisfaction and sense of calm that God wants you to experience, but that's not going to come through pleasure. Pleasure is taking. It's all about me. Like, you better deliver for me. I better get something out of this. This better be satisfactory to me. Whereas happiness is actually rooted in giving. It's about giving. Pleasure can be achieved through substances. If you take a drug, you say, how do people get into heroin? How do they get into cocaine? How do they get into these pills and pop all this stuff? Well, because there was something that they were getting out of that. Maybe they were trying to, deal with a broken life, and they're like unhappy. So they think, I'll take a substance and maybe it'll make me happy. Maybe it'll make me feel connected in community with others who are doing it. Pleasure can come through a substance. Happiness cannot and will never be achieved by substances. You will never, ever be happy if you take drugs. Never. Because it will be all-consuming. It will destroy you. It will take all the best of this life from you. He even says that the extremes of pleasure all lead to the same place, addiction. You become enslaved to the thing that once brought you pleasure. Happiness, there is no such thing as being addicted, however, to too much happiness. So in other words, it's like, wow, you're really happy. Yeah, I'm addicted to happiness. You're like, what? That's weird. Like, how do you do that? I don't know, but no, you can't be addicted to happiness. It's actually part of a process. It's something that kind of wells up within you as you sow and reap the right way. He also says this, and this is where we start getting into some neuroscience I think is fascinating. Pleasure is tied to dopamine, a very particular drug in the brain. The pleasure biochemical and neurotransmitter in the brain, it's tied to dopamine, whereas happiness is tied to serotonin, a completely different drug, the happiness biochemical and neurotransmitter in the brain. And so what we see here is that Lustig examines these things and finds that one of the reasons so many people are struggling, one of the reasons so many people are not happy, one of the reasons so many people have so much and are just dissatisfied with their lives is because they have an addiction to dopamine. We keep looking for the next thrill. We keep looking for the next high. We're not satisfied with anything. The main culprit to our problems is what he calls an addiction to dopamine. Getting the quick hit. You know, it's where we have sex. It's where we hit it big at the casino. It's where we drink alcohol, where we eat sugar, where we get a positive buzz. You know, even social media gives us a dopamine rush. Yesterday was my birthday. So on my birthday, and some of you who might have birthdays near Christmas, you know, you've been scarred, as I have, because, you know, you get one arm of the sweater for your birthday and you get the other arm for Christmas. And so you got issues, and we're going to start a recovery group. But so, you know, it comes along. And so I wake up in the morning, my phone's blowing up, and so is Facebook. And I want to see what's happening because some people knew. I don't do a lot on Facebook. I don't post a lot of stuff. But I am on it. I check it out. I like to like stuff. I like to like stuff. So I do that a lot. But I kind of looked at my phone and I was reading it. I'm like, man, people texted me. I got some calls. I got a bunch of texts. And, you know, a fair number of people on Facebook. And I'll admit, it's enjoyable to have people say, hey, we're glad you were born. I'm like, well, thank you. I'm glad I was born too. I'm, you know, doing the best with it. But, you know, and there's an enjoyment in that. But here's the difference. You know people who are not just enjoying social media, but addicted to it. Like, have you seen people, they're walking around with phones, like at the mall, and they walk into a fountain? Like, they fell into the fountain. They can't take their eyes off it because there's actually a dopamine dump in the brain looking at social media because we love to hear people's responses. And that's why some people post all the time, because they want somebody to respond to them. They get something out of it. I think what happens, though, is that when that quick shot of pleasure disappears, the question is, what do we do next? Lustig says there's a problem with dopamine, the pleasure seeking. It fizzles out. It doesn't last. And so we look for a new high. We become addicted to some things. A food addiction, a drug addiction, a porn addiction, a sex addiction. We become slaves to what once brought us pleasure. And ultimately, dopamine, and this is kind of the technical language, dopamine down-regulates serotonin. Dopamine actually undercuts our happiness. You know, we're less happy despite having so much money, so much freedom, so many resources, and we're so much more depressed than we should be in our culture. And that is an epidemic today because we're addicted to the thrill. And in fact, that pleasure chemical negatively impacts the chemical that makes us happy. What does this mean? In a nutshell, it's this. Lustig's research finds that the more pleasure we seek, the more unhappy we get. Completely contrary to what friends tell us, culture tells us, the world tells us, the more pleasure that you seek, the more unhappy you're going to get because that dopamine is going to downregulate the peace and calm that you should have and could have as you look for the next vacation, the next purchase, the next thing that you can have, the next high. Won't do it. You'll keep seeking more and more and more. In other words, happiness and pleasure are not synonymous. And we pay a very, very high price when that becomes our A1 priority. Pleasure doesn't make us happy. It actually just makes us really, really hungry. Now, let me just say one thing. We're not talking here about the elimination of all pleasure. Okay, we're not talking about that. We're not advocating some new Eastern religion here. No, we're not doing that, that would just kind of get rid of all pleasure and embrace pain or whatever they may say. No, we're not talking about that. But what we are saying, though, is that pleasure needs to play its proper role in our lives, and that's where we mess it up. You see, happiness is a process of sowing and reaping, and pleasure has its place only as it punctuates the process. So in other words, happiness is a process of sowing and reaping. We looked at that last week, how Jesus came and in his very first sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, right after he starts his ministry, he's doing miracles. People are coming to him. They want him to do something amazing. Jesus, the miracle worker, is in town. And we looked at that and we examined that. And Jesus' first message is the Sermon on the Mount. And his introduction is the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes are all about Makarios. Happy are those who live in a certain way. Right off the bat, Jesus taps into this desire that every human has, you have and I have, and every person who lived back then had too, to be happy. We want to be happy. Jesus taps into that and says, you can be happy when you follow the process of sowing and reaping my way. It will dawn on you one day as God pours his favor into your life, doing the hard thing, not the easy thing, that you're going to have joy and satisfaction and peace, a contentment that you cannot have any other way. And so this idea that maybe you've heard growing up in church, maybe you heard it. I think people have actually left church, said, I'm done with church. This is stupid. Because they've heard this philosophy, and I've heard it, and maybe you have too. It's the idea that God doesn't want us to be happy. He wants us to be holy. God doesn't want us to be happy. He just wants us to be holy. Well, here's the problem with that. It's a false choice. Actually, God cares about both. That's why he addressed it in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. He cares about both those things. And in fact, this process of sowing and reaping is not something that Jesus said alone. Paul says the exact same thing. You see, in the passage that follows the one where he critiques pleasure as a philosophy of life, as being an A1 priority, he critiques it. Right after that, he says there's a better alternative. Let's read about that. Instead of living for your pleasures, do this. And he talks about sowing and reaping, just like Jesus. Verse 22, he says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life. That is the way of the Gentiles that we just looked at. The way that puts us on the throne that says, follow your heart. Just do what you feel. Make yourself happy. Just do whatever you want. That was your former way. We were told to put off that old self. Put it away. It's going to damage you. It won't make your life better. Wow. You okay? So put off the old self. Put on the new way with the attitude of your heart, which is righteousness, which is holiness, which is putting off falsehood. Don't tell lies to one another anymore. I'm going to lie to kind of hide stuff and protect myself and advocate for myself. And so we create this crazy web, and it's like, did I say that or that? It's like, man, we just make our lives miserable with our falsehoods. We damage our relationships. Things don't get better. We come along and we put off this old self and we speak truthfully to one another. In our anger, we control this anger. Instead of using my anger, maybe I'm the boss, and I could use my anger and I could put you in your place, and I get a thrill out of controlling you. And it's like, man, that manipulation, bad idea. We use anger to control people, moods to control people. It's like in your anger, you got to step away from it. It's dopamine in the brain is going to destroy you. It's a fire. Let it go. Stop lying to each other. Stop coveting and stealing. Put that behind you. Stop gossiping. This whole idea that we look for the worst in people. We see that all the time, especially with all the political discourse. It's out of control. People are nuts. People are nuts today. We got a crazy world that is looking past all the diamonds so we can find some dirt. And when I find dirt about you or a coworker or another person, well, then I can expose the dirt, and we can talk about the dirt, and we can laugh about the dirt, and we can kind of just mock each other for the dirt. And am I really better off? No, I just ruined the culture. I ruined my heart. I lost part of my soul. So Paul's like, take that away. That's part of the old selfish way. Cursing, cutting others down, doing what feels good. There's a better way. We sow and reap our way to happiness. But then he says this, that happiness is a process of sowing, reaping, and pleasure has its place as it punctuates the process. So God does want you to experience pleasure. But pleasure is only beneficial when it interweaves and intertwines with God's sowing and reaping process. So here's an example. God created sexual pleasure. It was actually his idea. It wasn't some rock star that made it up. Like, hey, that's really cool. Let's write like songs, like crazy, wild, out of control songs. And isn't that great? It's ours. No, actually, God created it, and it was his idea, and the world hijacked it. So sex is meant to be expressed within the marital bond. It's when a husband loves his wife and a wife loves her husband. And now their sexual union within the proper boundaries is going to be that thing that enables them to build their bond. It's a pleasure that God wants them to experience. It's something God designed for the marital relationship. And it's way different than what the world says, where it's like, listen, if I think you're attractive, I think you got a great body, or you just got a great person, I want to be with you, so I'll use you, you use me. So the world says, just use people. You use people. Or, let's live together, and let's have sex so I can see if you're good in bed. And if you're good in bed, then maybe we'll go a little bit further and see what happens. Or maybe I'm just going to try out a relationship. I'll try it out. We'll live together a little bit and do our thing, have our fun and all. And, we'll find out if we're meant to be together like forever or anything like that. See, that's when we're lighting fires. That's when we're burning ourselves down. But God said, no, that within the proper sowing and reaping process that God has designed, sexual expression is an awesome thing. I think we also see this idea of, that there's pleasure in purchasing something. And you're like, wait a minute, we just had 2 messages on the perils of buying stuff, and that, happiness isn't something you get on Amazon, and all that is 100% true. But the truth is, there is pleasure in purchasing something. There is. But it only happens within the context of the sowing and reaping process that God has designed for our finances, where we pay our bills, where we're careful with our money, where we're saving, where we're investing for the future in terms of our retirement, and also where we're practicing radical generosity, where we're tithing. When we're doing all those things, then when there's an expenditure and we get pleasure out of it, it's more pleasurable. In fact, even for our family, I've noticed over the years, and Denise and I, we've talked about this, that over the years, we got 4 kids. Most of you know that. So we got a big group of kids, and we would take vacations every other year because that's what we could do. And we would take vacations, and it started to dawn on us over a period of time that we were actually getting a double dose of joy out of our family vacations. And we spent a fair amount of money. With 4 kids, we'd fly somewhere or do this or that. It was definitely an expenditure. It cost some money to do it. But I noticed, and Denise noticed, that we were getting a double dose of satisfaction, of joy out of this, because not only were we enjoying the process, the vacation itself, but we also loved that we were part of a larger context where we gave money, we gave of our finances, we gave in generous ways and tithe to something bigger than ourselves. That in fact there was satisfaction in knowing that we could have had different cars than we did. We could have taken more vacations, definitely more vacations, but we didn't, because we had values that were bigger than the experience. And that was something that brought us joy, knowing that we're storing up treasure, not just, trying to have an experience, but in heaven, we're committed to bigger things. That's going to pay off a lot more than anything we acquire or accumulate here. That's the idea then. We can experience pleasure, but it's in the context, the bigger picture of sowing and reaping and doing things God's way. Pleasure is only a problem. It only undermines our happiness when we do it in revolving around ourselves and don't sow and reap according to God's plan. So I want to ask you two questions as we wrap up. Two questions that I think can really help you. I know it helps me. Think through decisions, because you're going to face temptations. You're going to have people, you're going to have situations and circumstances and things come along to help you think about the decision you want to make. What is best for you? The first is this: is there a pleasure that is undermining your happiness? Is there a pleasure in your life right now that is undermining your happiness? Are you doing something today that triggers that kind of reward center in your brain, and you're like, this is good, this is thrilling, it's exciting, and you're driven to do it, and you want to do it, but then it just fizzles out, and then you feel the guilt. You feel kind of like remorse, like, I don't know, that I didn't have as much as I thought it would. It wasn't as good as I thought. Is there something today that undermines your happiness? Maybe a drive for more. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's becoming one. And when you face a decision, I want you to ask yourself this question. This can save you a lot of grief. It can actually build a legacy of joy that you will not have without regularly answering and asking this question. Ask yourself, will what I'm about to do lead to pleasure, or will it lead to happiness? Will what I'm about to do, is it going to give me pleasure, or is it going to make me happy? They're way, way different. If you prioritize happiness, happiness will elude you. If you prioritize happiness, if you prioritize pleasure, you're going to miss out on happiness. If you prioritize pleasure, you're going to be setting yourself up for pain. But when you come to that point where you sow and reap God's way, you can actually change things around. Turn it around from what you did in the past, because God says the best path, the path to joy, is you can actually sow and reap your way to the happiness you crave. So much so, you can plan on it. Let's pray.